So,
So, you got me this time. And I am joined on stage here by Derek Rowland, Chief Communications Officer, South Lake Regional Healthcare Center. Welcome to Derek, everybody. We're going to share a little bit about navigating the storm of effective strategies for crisis communication. And we've been talking all this time about customer experience, AI yesterday. Then we started talking about, the citizen really and how we deliver on that. and then we talked about how, at the end of the day, how do we deliver when something goes wrong, right? At the end of the day, that's what, if everything's going right, we wouldn't need to modernize, we wouldn't need to figure out to move with the times and figure out AI. So this idea about crisis communication is something that we were going to touch on a little bit, taking us in a little bit of a different direction, specifically about how to enhance transparency, foster trust, and improve service deliveries. All core values, I would say, for sure, in the public sector, private sector as well, but for sure, these are those things that we stand behind. So I'm going to start
just a small task, I think.
Well, I mean, everyone's trying to do it, so collectively we should be able to get it done, right? So what we start at the beginning. What are the key principles, and can you debunk some myths for us about effective crisis communication that the public sector leaders should prioritize to maintain trust with the public?
Well, thanks, Carla. And first, maybe before I get into your question, let me just say what an honor and a privilege it is to be up here on a stage with such an esteemed public servant such as yourself.
Thank you.
Someone who's been working for, honestly, the better part of 2 decades building our province through your work with the large infrastructure projects across the entire province. So thank you so much for all that you do. And I think that deserves a round of applause because you're doing a great job as a moderator as well. And I feel like moderators never get the attention that they deserve. So thank you for all that you're doing.
You bet.
Trust was actually the core operative word to your question there. And that's sort of where I wanted to focus a little bit of our time here together to debunk some of those myths around crisis communications. Because in many instances, many individuals think that it is episodic. But in fact, trust, if that's going to be the fundamental principle that you're building towards, isn't built in a day. And so in doing so, as a crisis communicator, though it may be considered a subspecialty of communications, you need to focus on continuing to cultivate that trust among your core audiences in order to set yourself up for success when those crises do arise. And so fundamentally, I see my role as both a communicator, as Chief Communications Officer for South Lake Health, but also throughout my career as well, focusing on 3 key principles. 1, being a trusted advisor, making sure that you are able to provide that counsel to senior executives in those crisis situations, but also understanding your subject matter expertise. 2, continuing to focus as a brand manager, building your organization's brand around its fundamental mission, vision, and values, what you stand for, both as a public sector entity, but also as an organization serving the public as well. And then also as a reputation protector, recognizing that there's always going to be individuals who will look to tear you down in situations that will inevitably arise to throw you off balance, throw your narrative into disarray as well. But so long as you're continuing to focus on those principles to cultivate trust, that's when you're going to be able to set yourself up for success in a crisis scenario, because trust, as we sort of alluded to, isn't built in a day. And so long as you're doing that work consistently through both proactive and reactive strategies in a crisis situation, you're going to be set up for success.
It's interesting that you tugged on brand there, because in our afternoon session, there was an entire segment around brand management and brand strategies. And really, when we talk about brand, it's your relationship with your consumer, and in this case, your relationship with the citizen. And I think sometimes in the public sector, we figure we don't have a brand, we're just the government, right? But the idea here is that it's very important because it garners you some of that trust.
Absolutely.
How can public sector organizations ensure alignment between messaging at the top executive level? You started to talk about that as a trusted advisor, but they got to listen to you, right? And frontline responders to maintain consistency and avoid confusion during a crisis.
So it is kind of twofold. I'll go back to that piece around both proactive strategies and reactive strategies. Continuing to build that trust proactively is something that is done through those day-to-day interactions, through not only your course of business, but also the individuals that represent your brand as effectively a brand ambassador on the front line. So we need to continue to focus on arming them with the resources that they need to be set up for success to build that brand, whether it be something as simple as boilerplate messaging or key messages to understand what your organization stands for, being able to interpret properly the mission, vision, and values that you stand for. But then also having those reactive strategies because, as we talked about, inevitably something will go wrong. In crisis communications, there's always sort of a running joke that, in fact, the motto that always lends well to these situations is from the Boy Scouts of America or Sparks, if you worked in that. Always be prepared. You always want to make sure that you're doing the work, planning for some of those scenarios, because while you may do, as I said, a ton of work for whatever the inevitable situation may be, there's only so much that you're going to be able to do. And so you need to continue to focus on not only putting those strategies in place, but continuing to test those and do the work so that it becomes almost routine for when those crises do arise. So for instance, I'll give an example of one that we do regularly in my role as a hospital communicator. We deal with individuals often in their most vulnerable circumstances. And in some instances, those who may have come into run-ins with law enforcement as well. And some great examples that you can do, tactics and strategies to deploy is working with those public sector partners, running different scenarios and using it to capitalize and test on how those strategies are going to be deployed in a situation. So one that we do regular, who knows what Code Silver is? Are there any healthcare people in the room here? Okay, that's actually probably a good thing. So a Code Silver in a hospital scenario is in fact an active shooter situation. Someone has come into the organization and looking to do harm either sometimes to staff or to patients themselves. And I can tell from experience that this is something that has happened. We hear a lot on the news of individuals who have been in, for instance, a gun interaction with someone out in the community and is then brought to the hospital. There are situations where those who are looking to do those patients harm do come in as well. But by working through these different strategies and these scenarios with your public sector partner and on your front lines, you can do that pre-work so that you're prepared to continue to guard against those situations that will effectively erode that public trust in your organization. Coupling it, as I said, with the proactive strategies, building that goodwill, that social license through your day-to-day interactions, so that when those crises arise, you're not starting from scratch. You've just sort of depleting the tank, so to speak, so that you've got a foundation to build off of and repair your reputation when the time comes.
Earlier on, we were talking about the people closest to delivering that customer experience, and in this case, that front line in the crisis management. We also got to give them power to be able to react in a way that's responsive at the time that may not been part of the script. I'm going to go offline a little bit, just take this in a part two. Any suggestions on how we get leadership to really accept that they need to give that power to the front line, the people closest to working with those who need their experience?
I actually wouldn't even say it's getting leadership to accept that. I would in fact argue that they already have. In a public sector organization, you are working with the public. You're on the front line of our healthcare system, of our transit system, of our judicial and law enforcement system. And in doing so, through this customer experience work that we've been unpacking over the past couple of days, but in your day-to-day interactions, you're arming your front lines with the understanding of how the business operates and how to act as that brand ambassador in order to properly represent your organization's modus operandi. And so in those situations, going back to your question, how do you get leadership engaged with that? That's often what I push back, and I will say we're already doing this. What we need to continue to do is support those front lines to get that information out so that we are guarding against issues continuing to escalate or become problems in of themselves, because there is a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy here where situations arise and then continue to bubble over and become crises in of themselves.
For sure. Crisis becomes another crisis.
Exactly.
That being said, so in a fast-paced crisis scenario, I mean, I would imagine all crisis is somewhat fast-paced. How do you strike a balance between being responsive and taking the necessary time to deliver accurate, thoughtful communication, which also speaks to that in the moment power to who's doing the communicating to respond?
Yeah, well, and kind of going back to what I was just saying, I'll also question then, what is the characteristics of a crisis? Because again, many will say that, oh, it's episodic. The plane has gone down at Toronto Pearson Airport and we need to be able to respond immediately. There's been a train derailment or an active shooter in a hospital. But in many instances, crises don't start so small. They grow over time. And how I would posit a crisis is effectively any situation that is going to do material harm to your brand representation. And back to your question of how then do you sort of guard against that and be responsive in those timely situations? Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. That's a situation there never is. I wish I could say there's a playbook to unfold a crisis, and Hollywood likes to say that, oh, it's so simple. If anyone watches Scandal, you can be the Olivia Pope, or West Wing be the C.J.
You
Craig.
You can't be Olivia Pope, is what you're saying?
Well, I mean, sometimes you can be the fixer, but not all the time. It doesn't always operate that way. And so if there is no silver bullet approach, you're always going to need to be able to adapt accordingly, understanding what that situation is that you're faced with, and having those huddle conversations, not only with your senior executives, but those that are involved as well, to figure out the best way to respond. And I will say from experience as well, those are very tough conversations to have, and particularly senior executives are looking to de-risk as much as they possibly can. And in many situations, in many cases that I've been in, it becomes a little bit of a bun fight with, forgive me, are there any lawyers in the room? Because others are always trying to de-risk from a legal perspective, recognizing that sometimes you want to be able to operate in a transparent manner, giving out information to the public so that you can navigate that crisis as effectively as possible. But in some instances, you'll have others who are trying to demonstrate that perhaps you want to hold some information back. And I'll give you an example of this, a scenario that actually my organization came up against probably about 2 years ago. And this is actually an instance where we didn't do very well. So about 2 years ago, it was an afternoon like any other, and I got a phone call. There has been a camera pen found in a staff washroom on one of our units.
Oh.
Yes. Immediately, it sparked off a ton of questions. Why was this camera pen there? Was it recording anything? How was it set up? Was it potentially recording something that was nefarious and could do harm to our brand? Or was it actually just an honest mistake? In healthcare, doctors in particular will typically use AV or dictation software to capture some of their experiences so that when they go to chart after the fact, they have all the information that they need recorded in order to put down a patient's chart and bill against it as well. In this situation, myself and my executive team, honestly, we got into a situation of analysis paralysis, going down this rabbit hole, evaluating all the different angles that could come out here, also having our lawyers in the room recognizing that perhaps we didn't do the due diligence that we needed to protect our staff because there wasn't a lock on this washroom door or something to that effect.
Yep.
And we chose not to do anything because choosing not to put anything out to the workforce is also part of a strategy. And that was actually something that got us in trouble because within a 24-hour time frame, not only had it gone around the organization through broken telephone, but it also got posted on social media as well. And in doing so, ended up attracting more attention. And so I use that as an example because we're talking about how best do you respond in those situations. And there is no silver bullet, but you need to try to evaluate what your audience needs in the moment and the context associated with it in order to come up with your communication strategy to meet their needs, maintain that trust and goodwill so that you are set up for success.
So for the last little while, we've been grappling with being able to match customer experience in the public sector with technology and AI. So what role do you see technology and social media playing in crisis communication? And how can public sector organizations use these tools effectively to engage with the public and respond to even misinformation sometimes?
Well, it goes both ways, doesn't it? Both the good and the bad. Because in a crisis situation where it is high profile, such as a train derailment or an airplane crash, you want to be able to get information out to the public as quickly as possible. Recognizing, too, that the general public, so long as you built that trust and that goodwill, will give you the benefit of the doubt. They'll recognize that it is an emergent situation and that you don't have all the answers at hand. And so long as you communicate that and make the commitment that you will be coming back, providing the updates in a timely manner as the situation unfolds, you'll be able to continue to maintain that trust. But going back to the example that I gave as well,
Exactly.
social media can also be the detriment too. It can become that chattering class online that becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy, continuing to escalate a situation where you may not see it as particularly impactful, but your audience will. And in doing so, they're continuing to spread not only that misinformation that you mentioned, Carla, but also reaching new audiences beyond your immediate organization out to the public as well. The example I gave was picked up by our local media, and within 24 hours I was getting questions about it and being scrutinized for our response, which obviously some of our staff didn't feel was up to snuff.
I know personally from my experience, when I was at Metrolinx, I was doing public consultation in the agent court community, and they were pissed, all right? But I was there, trying to give them the information. And when I look back on that experience, they were upset, they wanted information, they wanted to understand what was happening in their backyard. And we had charts, but they were charts. They were pieces of paper. I couldn't call up an address to find out exactly where the work was actually being done. I couldn't specifically talk about, the property line and where the track was going to be realigned. And so all those things, when I think back on that in terms, and it was a crisis, believe me, they were screaming.
Oh, I know.
But the idea, though, was while I was up there on stage, taking off my shoes, getting on all fours to try to figure out something to say to them, digitization and modernization of information technology would have helped me if I had everything into a system that we could pull up, that people could look for themselves.
Right.
So that helps.
Maybe if I can just pick up on that, though, Carla, simply because I want to make sure I'm not giving a doomsday situation or perspective as it relates to social media, because in many instances, those proactive strategies, using your social media followership, cultivating that brand online, and finding those brand protectors as well, those who really have an affinity for what your organization does and is able to go out and defend you in these crisis situations, can have a very positive impact as well. We see this a lot in healthcare. I was actually just in the Track 2 session, and Mary Agnes, who is actually a colleague I've run across at Mackenzie Health, Southlake and Mackenzie Health are just down the road from each other, was talking about how patient harm in a hospital, 1 in 7 interactions results in a patient harm, sometimes a medication reconciliation error, or they've developed a hospital-acquired infection, or something else has gone wrong through a particular treatment plan. But the point that I'm making here is things will inevitably go wrong, but if you can continue to talk about those positive aspects of your brand as well, because people are more likely to talk about the negative than they are the positive, through social media, you can continue to cultivate that audience and those brand defenders, recognizing that the majority actually had a positive experience versus the negative experience that you may be experiencing in crisis.
That's exactly right, because when I was there, I would think the rub of it all was that it was the first time in a very long time that we had came back and spoke to them, and we hadn't built that brand trust, if you will, between each other to accept the new information that was coming. I have one more question before we hand it over to the audience. How can the public sector leaders learn from past crises to build more resilient and adaptive communication strategy from future emergencies? I mean, past this prologue, and I think that everyone wants to learn and we've been talking about agile strategies and lean strategies, but is there something specific that we should just take away from recent crises?
I'll get to your question in a second, but I think you also need to back it up and identify when is the best time to reflect. Because again, going back, many people will say, a crisis is episodic, and if something has taken place and it's over, now's the best time to start debriefing and understanding what worked and what didn't work. But lending some words from Winston Churchill, never let a good crisis go to waste, too, right?
Okay.
And so there's an opportunity there to use the immediate timeline after that episodic crisis in order to continue to restore that good trust and the goodwill among your audience after that crisis situation that took place. I'll give another example here from my time at the hospital. About a year or a year and a half ago now, we actually had an arson attack. There's a lot that goes on in a hospital, I kid you not.
And we don't hear anything about it.
I swear. We had an individual come into our parking garage and ended up lighting on fire a Porsche.
Okay.
It was about 10:30 at night, and I got a frantic phone call from our director on call. And in that situation, our crisis response immediately kicked in. We were putting out some messaging on social media, recognizing that we didn't have all the information, but reinforcing confidence that the police were on scene, the situation was under control, that patients were safe, that we had put the isolation protocols as a result of airflow in the organization to make sure that smoke isn't spreading, and that the situation was contained. We had a fantastic response, even though it actually ended up resulting in an escalated crisis, because when the fire alarm went off and then the firemen came in, they ended up plugging into our water system, which ended up triggering a flood on the 6th floor of our hospital, trickled down about 3 floors, short-circuiting our telephony system and our RT system. It was a mess. But the point that I'm making is, the next morning, we never had to cancel a patient appointment. All surgeries continued to operate as normal, and no one would have known the wiser, except for the fact that you couldn't use the 3rd floor of our parking garage.
Yep.
And as a result, that's a win in my books. The hospital was still able to operate, and the public understood that this situation that was out of our control was well managed. And that presented an opportunity for us to continue to rebuild that trust and that goodwill. And so I took the opportunity to invite our local media representatives in to have a tour of the parking garage to understand what were we actually experiencing. It looked like a war zone had gone off. But in doing so, I brought our 4 senior leaders who were the immediate incident response team at the time to talk through those strategies and those workflows and protocols that they followed in order to make sure that the hospital still was able to open the very next day. And we were able to turn what was a very negative situation into a positive for us. And so back to your question of what can we do to learn from these situations? Let's also not forget about the opportunities that may be in front of us to capitalize and build on that trust, if that's the fundamental roles or fundamental goal here at the end of the end of the session. And also taking the time after that session or that timeline has closed to then have those debriefing conversations to see what worked against those plans that you had in place, what didn't, where are those gaps that need to be filled, so that in the event you're faced with it again, you're already set up for success.
So managing for business continuity, I think, is a good reminder, but also don't wait too long to kind of take those learnings, right?
Correct.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Derek, for talking to us today. Can we have a hand for Roz? So I'm looking out to my family here. Any questions? The mics will come to you.
Any crisis situations anyone wants to share? You've heard all my horror stories. And believe you me, working in a hospital is still a lot of fun. It's just challenging.
It's just challenging.
But then you get to share these great experiences with fantastic people like Carla on stage.
Thank you very much. And Track 2 actually had a lot of conversation around the healthcare sector that we were learning around technology, and I'm thinking putting those two together would be very helpful for our folks. So if there are no questions, you're off to lunch just a little bit early, 4 minutes early. We are going to have our lunch session in the opposite room as we've had, same as yesterday. We're going to come back in 85 minutes. yeah, 85 minutes so that we can dig into our survey one more time and we can give everybody extra chance to win that $100 Amazon card. Please take an opportunity to look at the exhibits and engage with the vendors. And of course, I would just politely ask that we actually clear this room because as I'm learning after all of our sessions, we do need to do a little bit of a cleanup before the next session. Have a good lunch, everybody.